Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the International Conference on COVID-19 Health and Humanities on the second day. Our subject of today's conference is talking about the racism and COVID-19. Let's welcome Professor Dan Changquan to give us opening remarks.
Good morning and good evening from U.S. I'm Changquan Zhan, Dean of College of Public Health, National Taiwan University. On behalf of the college, and I want to welcome all of you to participate this second day online conference of Humanity and Health. That is a continuation of our first conference in April. And yesterday in Taipei time, we have a good time and discussion with our European friends. And today we are happy to have a topic on racism and COVID-19 with our American friends mainly, but there are still many Asian participants in this conference. And as we are experiencing this ongoing pandemic, we are also seeing racial issues happening from the beginning of this pandemic, happening in everywhere, Asia, Europe. Now the focus is North America. So today we are happy to have our friends to tell us from their perspective on this. And again, thank you for coming to this conference in this difficult time, and I look forward to have a fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. And now we are moving to our first keynote speech. And we will invite Professor Bing-Zhen Xiong to introduce our speakers and chair this section. Please, Professor Xiong.
Good morning. Good afternoon to all of you. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be welcoming all of you to this session. I would like to introduce for you our colleague and good friend, Professor David Goldberg first. Professor David Goldberg now directs the University of California Humanities Research Institute, which is situated in Irvine, California. This is a University of California system-wide multi-campus research institute, serving all 10 campuses of the UC system and all of us too, beyond. David is a unusual person who publishes while he directs. So for this occasion, I would like to read a few titles from David. In 2015, he published this very important work called "Are We All Post-Racial Yet?" We are translating that into Chinese as of the moment and hope to release it. He also does research on digital humanities. So the same year he published Between Humanities and the Digital. He is originally from South Africa. So I suppose he can speak and feel and experience and understand more than many of us in terms of race, sides of race, conversation with him, that's published. And now I would say that he's like a rock star to many who followed his works. He also studied gender studies and other things. I'm extremely delighted that David could spare the time to give us a lecture on the racial virus, COVID-19 and racism. Please put our heads around to welcome Professor David Goldberg.
Thank you very much, Professor Shim. And to all the organizers, it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Even if from a distance, it feels like another time in another world. So let me just jump right in. SARS-CoV-2 is a virus of our time, one we are all involved in circulating, if not feeding. It courses across and through populations worldwide. It's a migratory virus. SARS-CoV-2 seeks a host to survive and to pass along COVID-19, the disease it produces, replicating and mutating as it takes up compoundly in one host's cells after another. Dread intensifies in the invisibility of transmission, the absolute anonymity of contraction, the anxious alienation of utter aloneness at the end of life. It expands and pervades in not knowing how one's constitution will respond in the face of infection, if not also social isolation. COVID-19, you could say, is dread's test tube, its crucial experiment. It invades us, eats at the body from inside, initiates a struggle that can kill. Rampant unpredictability and unforeseeability signal loss of control. Infection, one could say, is racism-like, the scorpion sting of the new pariah, social paralysis in the seepage. Dread is fueled interactively as much by the imaginings about contagion as by both the drama and mundaneness of the experience. Could you run the next slide, please? Are you there? Thank you. So you can see, this is a limited study, but you can see of the US, you can see the limited sense in which from these 580 patients, the contrast between white, black, and Latino infections. So whites make up almost 69% of the overall population of the US, blacks make up 12%, and so more than double, 2.5 times the rate of infection of their numbers in the population. Latinos, the infection rates differ so from place to place. And I should just mention, because it will impact other data that I show as I go along, that, that these numbers are constantly changing almost daily. I mean, obviously the rates change more slowly. The way in which those parts of the country that are less demographically diverse are starting to have big spikes in the middle of the country now. And so that would change the relative rates of white to black and Latino, and Asian for that matter. As authorities have reacted, dispositions of enmity and rhetorics of warfare have taken hold. They are familiar, easy to mobilize, broadly comforting to know there is a playbook at hand, a tried and tested game plan on which to draw, a rhetoric to fall back on. War on the virus soon slips into war on those made ill by it, those bearing it, even if asymptomatically and metaphorically its cause and carriers. This war on those made ill compounds the social warring those target populations have long had to suffer through. In the first weeks of the virus, reaching South African shores now, this in really March, end of March, the police presence in shanty towns dramatically ramped up to enforce mandated stay-at-home and distancing directives. Brazil's favelas fared similarly. Shanty towns are sprawling, compacted spaces of social life, self-styled from found materials. In South Africa and Brazil, housing the otherwise unhoused, those racially at the bottom of the social hierarchy. More residents have been killed by the enforcing police than by the virus itself, even today. Less so in Brazil, where the numbers, of course, have spiked, but in South Africa, for sure. COVID-19 has also assumed the mantle, in the words of President Trump, and his followers of China virus or Kung Fu virus in the febrile minds of the conniving and confusing, of those invested in stoking the, quote, coming China wars, his economic advisor, Peter Navarro. The racisms people of Asian descent have been the object of as the virus took hold are part of the racist toolbox, the contents of which are waiting to be taken up to knock the convenient distractions from the actual reasons for an inadequate response. Asian American medical personnel, doctors, nurses, technicians, and so on, are being spat on, cursed at, refused to be treated by patients who are saying, we don't want to be treated by Asian American medical personnel, receive social media death threats, and so on. Can you go to the next slide, please? War talk fuels, here you can see where nursing homes and so on, the differentiation. I meant to exclude the slide. I don't know why it was included over here. Can you go to the next slide then, too? Okay, so here you get to see the way in which numbers of African Americans relative to the population in the greenish color, and rates of infection in the red. So in all these states, as you can see scrolling down, the rate of infection of African Americans far outstrips their numbers in the population. War talk fuels viral dread in the name of mobilization against it. This is a projected war that cannot be won, because declaring America became the world's hotpot for viral contagion precisely because its projected prejudices were looking in the wrong direction. In March 2020, it closed its borders. America closed its borders. Oops, sorry. In March 2020, America closed its borders about 2 weeks or 2 months, depending on how generous one wants to be, to visitors from China. A year earlier, I mean, because of the feared infection rate, right? A year earlier, Italy was the first EU country to sign on to China's new Silk Road project, much to the chagrin of other driving member states of the EU. Chinese entrepreneurs quickly invested in northern Italy's fashion industry. They brought with their capital a high number of Chinese migrant workers. Prato, a manufacturing center outside Florence, held 60,000 such migrant workers. Their comings and goings alongside the fashion and cultural tourism, both Italy and China promoted to the newly moneyed, experientially hungry Chinese middle classes, created the circuits for the ease with which the virus took hold in Lombardy from November 2019, when the earliest cases are thought to have taken hold in Wuhan undetected. So the next slide, please. You can see the way in which, sorry, I think you want to go one more. Another slide. Yeah, out of order. By late February 2020, the first Italian cases were registered. So as a result of this back and forth, both by Italians to China and Chinese in particular to Italy. Pandemics globalize infection, diffusing them across space and time, but they concentrate their effects, intensifying their impacts from one place to another. So by early March, what you saw happening was a closing of the borders in the US, looking westwards to Chinese coming to visit the US. Of course, Americans who were in China were allowed to return home, but they left the borders open to people, at least at that time, completely to people coming from Europe. So just to give you one telling case, 13 American men, white men actually, went for a sports competition ranging between the ages of 30 and 50 roughly, 13 went together as a team to compete in a sports event in France. And being in Europe, they decided to go skiing for a day after the competition ended in the Italian Alps. And they arrived and they went helicopter skiing for the day. And by the end of the day, one of their group had fallen ill, and he tested positive for COVID-19. He was hospitalized and put in intensive care. He could barely walk. And all other 12 actually ended up testing positive. 11 of the 12, one stayed with him. I mean, he was really very ill. And the other 11 flew home via JFK in New York, flying back to California. And when they entered the country, they were asked by the immigration officer, have you been to China? And when they said, no, we haven't been to China, they were waved through with absolutely no further questioning and brought the European mutation of the virus back to California. And 6 of them themselves landing in hospital in California. They all survived. The virus has revealed in stark outlines the brittle social tissue holding together life today, the radically uneven and unequal vulnerability to calamitous large-scale challenges within and across societies. Viruses don't discriminate, as the saying goes, between the hosts in which they find an opening to settle. Once in, they replicate more or less readily according to the local conditions of vulnerability and immunological resistance. These conditions are a function of risk factors, rendered the more so by socioeconomic standing, access to healthcare and education, nutrition, and dignified living conditions. People who have to work in public places, whose work is deemed essential, who out of necessity have to share living quarters with large numbers of age-distributed people, whether family or not, are the more vulnerable. They are multiplied by those not in a position to afford sufficient nutrition or sustaining rest, medicine, or health enabling supplements. Overwhelmingly, they are not white. So you see in this slide the rates at which infections are higher than those of white people as the kind of control class. Race, class, and their interface accordingly are indicators, among other variables, of health and vulnerability. US cities such as Milwaukee and New Orleans experienced a significantly larger proportion of coronavirus deaths among African Americans than their proportion of the local population, and so too than those not Black. Next slide, please. In states with significant Black populations, these are completely out of order. In states with significant Black populations, overall, approximately 30% of infections and a third of COVID-19 deaths have been Black people, though making up just over 13% of the population. In Chicago, by May 2020, nearly 70% of US COVID-19 infections and deaths were among Blacks, double the proportion of the city's population and 5 times the mortality rate of whites. Of the initial 480 people affected in the city of St. Louis, 12 died, which is about 2.5% of those infected, all Black people. So all 12 of the first people who died in St. Louis were African American. Native Americans living on rural reservations in crowded housing with lack of running water face quickly rising death rates. Blacks, Native Americans, and Latinos have higher rates of high blood pressure and hypertension, diabetes, asthma, and cardiovascular disease, as well as significantly lower rates of health insurance than whites. So the common thread, if there is one, at least with respect to the European strain of the virus, is high blood pressure. There's a very high correlation between those who have died and having experienced high blood pressure, usually from stress-related conditions when admitted to the hospital. Nationally, African-American deaths from COVID-19 are nearly 2 times greater than would be expected based on their share of the population. In 4 states, the rate is 3 or more times greater. In 42 states, plus Washington, D.C., Hispanics, or Latinos make up a greater share of confirmed cases than their share of the population, and in 8 states, it's more than 4 times greater. White deaths from COVID-19 are lower than their share of the population in 37 states of the 50 and the District of Columbia, so 38 out of 51. So can you go to the next? This slide that you're looking at just shows the difference at the outset of the outbreak, the total unpreparedness of the United States, the kind of personal protective equipment that US medical people were having to really throw together, and the kind of equipment that was readily available pretty much to all medical people in China and Italy. So can you go to the next slide? Yeah, these are completely, forget the slides, they're completely out of order. Major holes in the data remain. 48% of cases and 9% of deaths still have no race tied to them. A little more than half the states in the US actually register infections and deaths by race, ethnicity, Black, white, Latino. And so if one doesn't know who is sick, and in the presidential urging not to test, to slow testing down, to make him look better, we're not going to know literally in 6 months or 12 months or 18, however long it takes, who should be getting vaccinated. We're not going to know whether we should be direct or protected. National Public Radio did an analysis that found that in 32 states plus Washington, D.C., Blacks are dying at rates higher than their proportion of the population. In 21 states, it's substantially higher, more than 50% above what would be expected. For example, in Wisconsin, at least 141 African Americans have died, representing 27% of all deaths in a state where just 6% of the state's population is Black. Aggregated relative risk of death estimates for Black compared to the white population is nearly 4. And is nearly 4 for the Latino population. The index is nearly 2 times higher the risk of death than white patients. So you can see the really inordinate maldistribution of the relation of both infection and in particular deaths, race-driven in the United States compared to white people. This is far from a US phenomenon, one has to say. In Britain, Black men are 3 times more likely than white men to die of COVID-19. That's men, male. The Black death rate double that of the population at large. Roma across Europe and Palestinians in Israel, Palestine, experience similarly health compromising life conditions with comparable viral vulnerability. Worldwide, those with less ready access to clean running water are significantly more likely at risk. Those confined to the rightlessness of, say, refugee camps, often invisible at the margins of contested jurisdiction, are the most vulnerable. Living in dense environments where physical distancing is impossible, they mostly lack adequate healthcare, are already undernourished and overstressed. In both these challenged conditions in high-income countries, a growing ratio of frontline health workers are migrants, mostly people of color. Hereby, COVID-19 is having a disproportionate racial impact on those most committed to stemming its tide for others. Dread registers as the irrepressible reminder that the whole world is on was on lockdown, you could say, but for those caring for those who are or were. In more overdeveloped economies, disproportionately Black and brown people. That is because of migration and the incapacity of a society like the US, for example, but we see it in Britain too, to reproduce medical workers locally. There's a disproportionate number of those in essential positions in the medical professions who are not white. Whites, after all, only make up roughly 11.5% of the global population. Viruses, in short, don't discriminate. We do. Sometimes you could say a cough is just a cough. Societies discriminate in the everyday, but also in the way that become embedded and reproduced more or less silently through social structure with fatal implication. The rate of premature death is an index of structural racisms and of their deadly effects. Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism as a condition of the production and reproduction, the structural reproduction of premature death. That is, those populations of color who are subject to racism are likely over lifetimes to have their lives ended prematurely were they not subjected to those conditions. COVID-19 has faced medical decision makers with determinations over life and death. In the face of medical resource availability, short of widespread need, protocols have been developed to guide these decision makers about who might more readily have access to life-saving technologies. Other considerations being equal, the presence of comorbidities in one patient rather than another becomes a key factor in determining access. A considerably higher rate of comorbidities faces Black, Latino, and Native American than white patients, as I've said, an otherwise neutral seeming set of considerations with life-determining outcomes like, say, saving the maximum amount of lives, accordingly tend to get built into the algorithms on which medical decision makers rely to guide them in determining the probable outcomes of pursuing one course over another. Probabilities are silently reinforced, not just pre-existing conditions, but pre-existing racially indexed structural inequities and systemic prejudices. If you're, if the population, say that is Black, tends to be less healthy than the population that is white, if the algorithm is saying save most lives, means that you save those who are more readily easily savable, then of course the algorithm is discriminating in order to save the white life just by virtue of racial determination than the life that is not white. As COVID-19 has evidenced, aging populations across the global north even more clearly need younger people to fill the roles of essential workers across pretty much all the registers that this newly valued pandemic concept references. Essential workers are caregivers and providers of the baseline needs to survive. They are far more diverse than the newly vulnerable populations whose lives they are now visibly enabling. Caregivers have come to emerge out of cultures of more diverse and non-nuclear family forms where respect and care for elders resonate more deeply among nuclear and self-interestedly competitive modernizing social traditions. There's a violent irony, consequently, and now I'm shifting to an argument about racist theory. There's a violent irony, consequently, French commentator Alain de Benoist, one of the intellectual progenitors of today's white nationalism, denouncing what he calls left racism as leading to what he calls the homogenization of the world. De-emphasizing ethnic differences, he charges with no argument or evidence, would lead to what he calls ethnocide, the killing off of ethnic groups as ethnic groups. His worry, the worry of white nationalists, is the obliteration of the right to difference, what he calls the right to difference. His implication is not to defend all difference, quite the contrary. It is to ensure that what he calls the right to live with one's own ethnic kind, in his case to self-consort only with what he calls Europeans or whites, the rest to be kept beyond borders or eliminated. Difference, in short, is invoked to rationalize homogenization. The paranoia represented by this ethno-differentialism develops out of the anxiety of losing the familiar, of what might become of one's life once control is lost, power forgone or foreclosed. The dis-ease about a future so-called overrun and infected by those taken to be the not us, those not sharing a way of life, common values, common sense. the ill at ease with the world Benoist won't recognize by looking in the mirror. Underlying this viral irony of nationalizing racism is another. The claim to ancestral birthright belonging pretty much wherever it occurs must be read against the historical record that every nation state has no ancestral purity. All states are multiplicitly constituted through old and newer movements of groups into and out of territory as a result of the artifice of bordering, settlement and unsettlements, wars and colonizations, ecological disruptions and disease, economic opportunity and destruction. We are all more naturally alike than different, and more diversely made up than we tend to recognize. As Bob Dylan recently sang, I contain multitudes. Black, brown, and Asian figures, unknown and fantasized and real, are transformed into these phantom bearers of threatened disinheritance. Given the ethno-racial impacts the biosocial virus has extended, white nationalists are lauding the projected eugenicist implications. Some white nationalist groups have actually advocated for using COVID infection as a bioweapon to naturalize their commitments to so-called cull the population. Resentment, the manifestation of unresolved dread turned to vicious, deadly anger, grips those who feel the world they owned and entitlements they possessed have been wrongly wrenched from them by some alien force experienced as the dreaded. What vision of future survivability faces us then, together even as we've been torn apart? On one side, a Reddit image, the social media platform, a Reddit image spoof post of a white woman. So this was a fabricated image, but it's quite telling, and I wish I had the slide. Maybe if you just scroll down the slides, it's in the next or the next. I don't know, because the order has been upset. No, the next one. Let's see if we can sort of catch up. No, somewhere slides were lost along the way. So there's this image that was posted of a white woman, social distancing protesters, so somebody said end social distancing, holding up a sign reading Barack 6 equals 6, Hussein equals 7, Obama equals 5, and together equaling COVID-19. So there's a poster she's holding in public that reads Barack 6, Hussein 7, Obama 5, the so-called numbers of the number of letters in each name, adding up to COVID-19. The image is politically fabricated, so it doesn't quite add up. I mean, the actual addition of 6 and 7 and 5 is 18, not 19, so you get the point, right? On another, that is another image or another story, an exhausted emergency room doctor in Brooklyn, New York, movingly acknowledged the global appreciation of emergency room staff as a consequence of the pandemic, rather than the more usual New York abuse. You know, New Yorkers are notoriously abusive of everybody else, right? Even in the emergency room. The appreciative generosity showered upon them by their Park Slope neighbors was materializing in mounts of caloric food being gifted to the emergency room. So people living around the hospital would bring tons and tons of high-calorie food. The running joke among the staff was that they would be, quote, gaining the COVID-15. So they'd be putting on 15 pounds of weight. The counter to dread then is collective inspiration in the working together towards equality, respect, and dignity in difference. It involves a striving and achieving in common together. This commons, healthcare, education, social security, unemployment for all, water supply, unemployment insurance for all, water supply and utilities. Lacking these things creates not only the incapacity to address the immediate needs in a pandemic outbreak or serial climatic disasters requiring sustained attention, but pressures the society to pursue high-risk undertakings, such as premature economic activity requiring robust person-to-person interaction at high risk to the health of all, and especially of the more vulnerable. the undercutting of the social infrastructure of the commons in favor of radically individuated personal responsibility comes with postponed and so significantly enhanced long-term economic costs too. And those long-term costs will, as I've indicated, have dramatic racial effects or impacts. The antidote to viral anxiety then is to make the planet more livable, as much pandemically as techno-economically, ecologically and politically. It calls for imagining a new world, or our worlds anew, without segregations or social purifications or securitized homogenizing. This reconstruction will necessitate attending to inequalities in opportunity, wealth, income, and political power. There's no easy fix to all of this. To the heating up climatically and politically across town and country, as much across wider political and climatic geographies. In America, there are parts of cities that have a 10 degrees Celsius difference in temperature in summer between the wealthier parts, which are greener, and the parts inhabited by populations of color, which are pretty much all brick and cement. So you can see the way in which ecologies of care are integrally threaded with eco-formations of equality in social formations of trust, respect, and dignity. And you're seeing that play out on the streets today. I'm nearly done. Cooling down the temperature, ecologically, politically, economically, is of a piece. It's the last paragraph. An ecology of caring is not simply reducible to the one-to-one, the face-to-face. It concerns also crafting caring social infrastructure. Absent, eroding and failing social infrastructure tends overwhelmingly to affect communities of color and the poorer more directly and deeply. So Flint, Michigan's water crisis a few years ago, which lingers today, is obviously revealing, but so too the all too often abandoned living condition of indigenous communities, along with the mostly black and brown shantytown and degentrified inner city dwellers globally almost everywhere. An ecology of caring demands attention to the equality and impacts of enabling social design, resources, and infrastructures of living from the residential and educational to work and recreation. I'll just end by saying this, that those societies that are built on an infrastructure of caring, you think of New Zealand, of South Korea, of maybe Germany, places like that, have fared, Taiwan, have fared far, far better in addressing the pandemic than those societies where the caring economy has been eroded, such as the United States and Britain. So I'll just end with a rallying cry, a kind of meme for our time, which is flatten the curve, anyone that comes along. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. That's a rich paper, systematically and clearly read. It's very timely too, exactly what many of us needed it. We would have a lot of time to hear from the roundtable and also discuss with others in the audience.
Thank you. And now we are moving to our second keynote speech, and I will invite Professor Xiu Chen to introduce the speakers for us and chair this session.
Okay, good evening everyone, and good morning in Taipei and Singapore. Yeah, I'm Tony here. So great. It's okay. Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Tony Chen, and I'm so great to have the second day meeting to talk the relation on the air. And I think following the David's speech, I think we have Professor Warner to have another speech. And Professor Warner, she's the chair of Department of the History and the University of the Minnesota. And if you look at his experience and also research, you can see cover a wide range of the the study on on ritual law, religion, and also particular. You can see she has been devoted to the traditional Chinese history study for a long time, and everything I look at is so interesting for our Asian country, and also she has been an editor of the Journal of Asian Study before, and also devoted herself to many, the the editorial association and also a academical journal as well. So I invite her to give a speech to be coupled with the David about the racism. But later on, provide a very, the new subject, is called the race and higher education and the COVID-19. I think because I think her lecture will cover about how the university have, in response to COVID-19, and what is in relation to the race issue about the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's welcome Professor Warner to deliver this speech, and thank you so much. And Anne, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I am speaking from Minneapolis as the chair of the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. It has been a complicated month in Minneapolis. It's been very hard in some ways, but inspiring in others. And I begin with a lighthearted internet meme. David cited Dylan. I'm going to refer to Prince. Can we see the next slide? Okay, so this is an internet meme. Nobody thought the revolution would start in Minneapolis except for Prince. Prince was, of course, a local pop music icon who's beloved in Minneapolis for a lot of reasons. The main reason is his music, but another reason is his loyalty to Minneapolis. He once said on national TV, "I like Los Angeles, but I like Minneapolis better." And of course, one of the names, the name of one of his bands was The Revolution. So nobody thought the revolution would start in Minneapolis except for Prince. It's not clear that a revolution has started, but I think it's not foolish optimism to say things will never be the same. We are at a flashpoint. As you probably all know, on the evening of May 25th, which is Memorial Day, it's a day that celebrates America's war dead. And it's also a day that begins summer. People celebrate it with cookouts and going to the beach. On that day, an unarmed African-American man named George Floyd was murdered by a white police officer, while three other officers, one of whom was Asian American, one of whom was African American, and one of whom was white, watched on and did not effectively interfere. Next slide. If one were to write a dystopian novel, one might begin it with the police murder of an unarmed Black man in the midst of a global pandemic. That is the world we're living in now. It has its dystopian qualities, but there may be a way out of this dystopia. The crisis may be making things more legible. Surprising things appear in the news every day. There was a news poll taken by the Wall Street Journal and NBC on May 28th that said more people were afraid of police violence than they were of looters. And by May 28th, the city of Minneapolis had already had its very violent protests. So we may be on the brink of reframing the crises which confront us. So in the days that followed the murder of George Floyd, there were peaceful protests that turned violent. Hundreds of buildings were burned and looted, and in fact, more than 1,500 buildings in the Twin Cities were damaged to some extent. Some have reopened, some have announced reopening dates in the future, some will never reopen. My grocery store no longer exists. I mean, it's the infrastructure that a lot of us used does not exist anymore. Next slide, please. So Donald Trump did say on June 18th, if the Democrats win, the whole country will be Minneapolis. When he said that, he meant the looting and the violence. But I think Democrats in Minnesota have kind of adopted that as they've repurposed that as a positive slogan. In the coming together of the community after the violence, there were really quite remarkable things that happened. The community came together to question the undeniable structures of racism that we live in, and they brought food to people whose neighborhood grocery stores had burned. Can I see the next slide, please? And this is a little bit like people taking food to emergency workers. This particular school, put out a call and said, please bring food, we're giving it out. And a couple of hours later, they sent out another call and said, please stop bringing food. You know, send us money in 3 weeks. But the outpouring was really quite strong. Next slide, please. So the summary of the last month in Minneapolis: there was a murder, there were protests, there was destruction, and it is possible that there will be a rebuilding which will mend some of the things that caused the problem. I want to shift here a bit and talk about the parallel tracks of COVID-19 and political protest and the ways in which they've shaped our work, my work in the history department. And I want to say at the outset that I do think my university administration is acting in good faith. And I think that the higher administration has been fairly transparent in the decision-making process. But we are faced with such unknowns, it's almost impossible to plan. We're faced with massive budget deficits, but we don't know how massive. We are worried about enrollments for the fall for several reasons. And I think one of the reasons we're so worried about enrollments is we can't actually confront that what we're worried about is massive death. But one of the reasons we're worried about enrollments is 72% of our budget comes from tuition. The number of students who put down deposits to guarantee their place in the freshman class is about the same as last year. I think a new slide, maybe now. A new slide, please. Yes. So the ideal size of the freshman class is about 6,000. Like I said, 72% of the budget of the College of Liberal Arts comes from tuition. About 30% of the entering class is people of color, 1,000 of them roughly. The person who gave me this data made me promise I wouldn't give it precisely. He said I could just talk about general trends. About 1,000 of them are Asian Americans, about 400 Black, about 300 Latino, about 85 Native American, and this perplexes me. I'm not sure how 29 Hawaiians are going to end up as freshmen at the University of Minnesota, but it looks like that will happen. Most of the Asian Americans are the children and grandchildren of Southeast Asian refugees who came in the 70s and 80s and even later than that as a result of the destruction of the American war in Vietnam. So far, the news we have about enrollment is good, but there are always students who put down deposits who don't come. Next slide, please. Okay, so actually, this is a summary of the last slide. The next slide, please. So how will fall instruction be delivered? And one of the questions that I'd like to put on the table, and I think somewhere I have a slide where I say this, but we don't need to look for it now. I think there is a serious question. How do you make ethical decisions in times of great uncertainty? If you are committed to making decisions that are driven by data, how do you do that when the data is ever changing? And how do you create structures which allow other people, oh, thank you very much. So if you're committed to making decisions based on data, how do you do that when the data is changing? How do you create structures where people can make decisions which are suitable for their own situations? How do you make space for diverse voices to be heard in times of crisis? I think these are important theoretical questions, but I think they're also operational questions. Is what is it that you do as an administrator to make it possible for these things to happen? So one of the things that preparing this talk has enabled me to do is step back and look at my own work from a broad perspective. And anyone who's ever done administration knows that day-to-day work is mainly answering emails and solving what I think of as kind of micro crises. Somebody needs help with an internet tool. Somebody doesn't understand a new rule about syllabi. Somebody's upset about salary cuts. I mean, those are all things that you need to deal with. But the micro crises revolve around truly large questions. And I think one of the large questions is, how will fall instruction be delivered? We dealt with an emergency turn to online teaching in the fall, as I think many of you did. The second week in March, the University of Minnesota was on spring break. During that week, the reports of the spread of the virus in North America became increasingly alarming. There were rumors that classes might go online after spring break was over. So on Tuesday, before any decision had been made, but there were lots of rumors, I called the best person I know who deal in the technology division of our university who deals with technology and pedagogy. And I said, will you do a workshop for us on online pedagogy? And she did. She did it on Thursday of spring break, by which time it had been announced we were going to go online. We had a face-to-face meeting. It's the last face-to-face meeting any of us had. My colleagues who were other department chairs said to me, wait a minute, you're organizing a workshop on technology and pedagogy in spring break, and you really think your colleagues are going to come? Well, I invited all faculty and all graduate students, and 50 people came, which I think is a sign about how committed my colleagues are to doing a good job in an emergency. Next slide. So there is the pivot to online teaching. There were workshops, and it was reasonably successful. Most of my colleagues were quite surprised at how well online teaching went. I should say the bar for their expectations was pretty low. Most of them had no interest in online teaching, and they were convinced online teaching would be a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And when it ended up being effective in some ways, they were pleasantly surprised. I skimmed the teaching evaluations from that semester, and they were actually quite good. I have to say that one of the things that sort of tempers my enthusiasm about that is the response rate was very, very, very low. They're probably the students who probably wandered off simply didn't fill out the evaluations. But things went pretty well. I think we were motivated by something like crisis adrenaline. We were in a crisis. We had to work together. We had to do things we didn't want to do. But we knew it was an emergency, so we got together and did it. But of course, as is often the case, the crisis lasts longer than the adrenaline. And I think we may be entering a phase where we are no longer in a phase of crisis adrenaline. I think people are starting to get a little bit bored and fed up. And it seems to me that the pandemic is a form of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. What he's talking about is environmental damage, environmental destruction, things that don't happen all of a sudden. They happen over a long duration of time, but that doesn't mean they're not violent. And I think actually, although he wasn't talking about pandemics, I think that it's a useful term to think about what we're going through. So there are many uncertainties, but I think it is certain that this will not be over soon. And the question is whether or not we can cope for the long haul, or to put it a more optimistic way, how can we cope for the long haul? Next slide. So Michael Osterholm, who is an infectious disease epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota, a couple of days ago, and I can't remember whether it was an article he wrote or a news interview, he said there's not going to be a second peak. He said peaks imply rise and fall. There is not really going to be a fall. Peaks are the wrong metaphor. And he said where we are is we were in the second inning of a 9-inning baseball game. I find that depressing. I also think it's very interesting that when we talk about the trajectory of a disease, we need metaphors, peaks and valleys, or baseball games. So one of the key parameters of decision making about the very concrete question of how do we deliver education in the fall has to do with degrees of vulnerability to the disease. But the degrees of vulnerability are not stable. And when the decision was made to open the University of Minnesota in the fall, and I'll talk about that much more. When the decision was made in June, it really did look like cases nationwide were maybe leveling off. But since early June, there has been a spike in new cases nationwide, though the Minnesota numbers continue to fall, though not at the rate we'd like. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is new COVID infections in the US as of June 23rd. And as you can see, the new infections are now almost as high as they have ever been. And so I think that is really quite profoundly worrisome. Can I see the next slide? These are the new cases in Minnesota also as of June 23rd. These are, because the numbers get rounded and smoothed off, since these are much smaller numbers than the national numbers, the peaks are sharper, and you can see they're ups and downs, but there was a big up after the last down. So we don't know how long this disease is going to last. It looks like it's going to last a long time. We are forced to plan in conditions of profound lack of knowledge of even the biological parameters we are functioning in. Can I have the next slide, please? So Joan Gable, who's president of the University of Minnesota, and she probably took over maybe just a month before this hit. She's a young woman. She's 50 years old. She's smart. I like her. But it really sort of hit. We also have a brand new provost. so the president of the University of Minnesota announced in mid-June that the university would open up in the fall. The Board of Regents endorsed that decision on June 12th, but the way our Board of Regents works is they normally discuss something one month and then vote on it the next month. The Board of Regents still has not yet voted on the plan, but we expect that we will open up in the fall. Can I see the next slide, please? So what does open up mean? Faculty will have a choice as to whether they teach online, in person, or some combination. The university has made it very clear that there is no default position. My colleagues were unhappy about that. They said it would be much easier for them if there were a default position and they could either go along with it or oppose it. And so I said to them, you want a default position for the history department? And they said, yes. And I said, okay, the default position for the history department is our courses are going to be online. And about 80% of my colleagues have chosen to deliver courses online. About 20% will deliver them in person. We have 73 courses ranging in size from 12 to 176. The decision making is based, I think, largely on people's assumption of the evaluation of their own risk of contagion, but also risk that the illness will be serious. And so when I told them that the default position of the history department was going to be teaching online, I also told them that anyone who wanted to teach face-to-face would be supported to do so. I'm confident that the online teaching will be okay. I'm not confident that it will be excellent, but I'm confident that it will be okay. We are continuing to have workshops. My colleagues are dedicated and passionate teachers. I am fairly sure that online teaching will be safe. Face-to-face teaching is another matter. Many American universities have announced that they will have face-to-face teaching in the fall and that they will offer instruction in a way that is consonant with safety guidelines. Can I have the next slide, please? So, observing health guidelines. The first thing that the Minnesota Department of Health has mandated is that in our classes, we do social distancing, and social distancing is 6 feet between people. They have calculated that this means classrooms can have only 25% occupancy. The building we have most of our history classes in does not have rooms that are large enough under those conditions to hold a normal history class. And so what does reopening mean? Now, in the memo the president sent out, she said classes will start 8 o'clock in the morning. They will go to 10 o'clock at night. There will be Saturday classes. And I'm actually quite sure that if I get colleagues who are told they will be teaching at 9 o'clock at night, they will say, oh, online doesn't sound so bad. There will be hand sanitizers, not dispensers, not in every classroom, but in the entrance to every building. There will be posters all over the place telling you to wash your hands. Masks is an interesting issue. The Minnesota Department of Health says all persons who are out in public need to wear masks. They do not require it. It is a very strong observation. The city of Minneapolis requires masks in public places. The University of Minnesota, which is located in the city of Minneapolis, strongly recommends mask wear, but does not require it. And there may be several reasons for this. Surgical masks are still in short supply. I know that's hard to believe, but it is true. The Department of Health for a very long time discouraged people from buying them and wearing them because healthcare providers and first responders had a deeper need for them. What has happened is people are in large numbers making cloth masks. Fire departments are collecting cloth masks that are homemade and distributing them to people who need masks. I have cloth masks that friends have made and given to me. There are people who argue that cloth masks are minimally effective, especially when they don't fit properly, and that they give a false sense of security. That is a minority opinion, but it is actually the opinion of Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota, who is one of the president's advisors on these things. I think another reason the university might have decided not to mandate masks is the difficulty of enforcing a mandate. I mean, what do you do if you require masks and someone doesn't wear a mask? We are telling faculty members that they may require masks in their own classroom, the same way they may require people to put their cell phones away. And I should make it clear that I have no insight into the decision-making processes at the presidential level. I'm just speculating on what the logic of not requiring masks might be. And a final point, which I don't think went into the president's decision-making, but I think is relevant to talk about, is the growing politicization of mask wearing. In an article in the Wall Street Journal on June 18th, President Trump said that people were wearing masks to show that they disapproved of him. And so, I mean, I think that feeds into the problem of mask wearing in the United States. Earlier, I said that the city of Minneapolis had mandated the wearing of masks in public. The president of the university does not believe the mask order applies to the university because it is constitutionally an independent entity. The mayor disagrees with her. We will see how that unfolds. Hand washing and hand sanitizers will be followed. Students with symptoms are asked to stay home or in the dorm rooms. I have heard no talks of temperature checks. So I asked the dean's chief of staff about it, and she said she could not imagine us mandating temperature checks. But she checked with the facilities management people, and they said they were going to encourage people to take their temperature every day before they left home. And the person in charge of the Office of Classroom Management told me that privacy concerns would preclude more public testing. So I'm going to conclude by talking about ways in which the pandemic has laid bare racial issues. And a lot of the information I'm going to repeat a number of things that, or I'm not going to repeat things that David said, but a lot of what he said is completely relevant here. I was involved in teaching a course on the pandemic in this May term, and Marta Hansen actually came and gave a wonderful talk. And one of the students wrote in a paper that the virus does not care which bodies they attack. They attack all bodies equally. And I mean, as David's talk really wonderfully showed us, it may be true that viruses do not care which bodies they attack, but it's equally true that all bodies do not respond in the same way. And I think to save time, I will, I guess, can you show the next slide? Yeah, these are, it's another way of showing the same data that David showed. Black Americans, 61 deaths per 100,000, white Americans, 26 deaths per 100,000. So the racial disparities there are very clear, and And David did a good job of talking about some of the reasons for those racial disparities. So I think that we can see here a conjunction of the two crises, the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis precipitated by what local African-American activists are now calling the George Floyd uprising. George Floyd was murdered by police violence, which disproportionately targets African-American men. When massive demonstrations began, and they began in Minnesota on May 26th, people were concerned that large numbers of people gathering, chanting, shouting, singing, some socially distancing, some not, some wearing masks, some not, would precipitate a radical increase in the number of cases. That doesn't seem to be the case. The percentage of protesters who are testing positive seem to be roughly that of the general population. People at the protests carried signs saying police brutality is a public health issue. And as David told us, Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism as structural reproduction of premature death, which makes it very clear that racism is absolutely a public health issue. Can I see the next slide, please? The conjunction of the two crises is shown in this slide, and this mask that demonstrators wore to protest. The I can't breathe is one of the last things that George Floyd said, and the masks, are because of the illness. There is strong talk for police reform in Minneapolis and elsewhere. There continue to be massive demonstrations, most of them peaceful, demanding racial justice. We in the history department have done several things. We added a course on Black protest. We, after the demonstrations, before the demonstrations happened, we hired 2 new people of color, one a faculty member and one a postdoc. We are sponsoring a series of workshops with partner institutions that are historically Black universities, Spelman and Morehouse in Atlanta, and Howard in Washington, in which we will engage in conversations about systemic racism and how we can combat it. We will vote, and we write for national media, and we speak at events like this. I'd like to conclude with a reference to a book that I have not yet read because it has not yet been published. Can I see the last slide, please? The book is called A Moment of Silence. It's edited by an African-American playwright and actress. She's fairly well known. Her name is Sha Cage. And in case you can't see the description, A Moment of Silence is an urgent and compelling anthology that illuminates an unabashed and missing narrative told by Black writers living in Minnesota on the heels of the George Floyd uprising and COVID-19. So it's a book that will come out on June 26th. And the idea I got this afternoon was actually to institute a course in the history department in which we will read this book. And I've actually asked Sha Cage if she would be interested in teaching the course. She hasn't responded, but even if she isn't interested in teaching the course, I think that that we will have it. Marlon James has been nominated for National Book Awards. Danae Smith has also been, he's a poet who's been nominated for lots of national awards. The fact that there are 50 African-American artists writing in a communal way that could put together a book basically within a month, I think is a really quite remarkable, phenomenal thing. I mean, I think that the fact that there is that aspect that there is that aspect to Minneapolis, I think gives me hope that there may in fact be profound change here, and that the revolution may well start in Minneapolis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for giving so instructive and inspiring speech, particular on providing how your university make a decision to react different situation of education and enrollment of the student, and also how to make a decision and reopen, the classes. And also, I think, this is a highly relevant to racism, particular to academical and also student. And also, thank you so much for sharing your thought on, everything with your education system. I think there must be several questions to be discussed, and because we have a roundtable discussion, so we can have a vigorous discussion in the next section. And so let's have a coffee break. Then we have a roundtable discussion to talk about the two speech. And thank you so much, Anne, and enjoy your speech. And thank you for your chairing the next section about roundtable discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we are going to have a 10 minutes break. And I will send you a reminder before we start. Yes, we will have a 10 minutes break, and I will send you a reminder before we start our roundtable discussion. Thank you. We will start our roundtable discussion within 1 minute.
Phil. Okay, hope everybody is back. And yeah, I think this time we have online meetings and we have two speech, but the major feature of this online meeting is to provide a roundtable discussion, which is different from the previous meeting in in April. So I think the idea is good, but you know, we have to also control time. You know, so before I ask Anne to chair this section with David, and I will ask Mindy, my research fellows, and because our College of Public Health, NTU, we have a team, you know, to deal with this online meeting, and they spend much time in organize these. And the first things, you know, I also ask young generation to be familiar with the all experts involved in the humanity, and particularly this time we have already invited so many experts talking about racism. So that's Mindy to introduce the expert one by one, and with their curriculum written, you know, on the screen, and you can see their previous experience and research, particular for our audience on live show, and at the same time to listen to the roundtable discussion. So, Mindy, can you start? Yeah.
Thank you. And now we will have our roundtable discussion on the topic of solution to COVID-19 with the problem of racism. And we will invite 9 distinguished professors to join this discussion. Firstly, we will invite Professor David Goldberg, who gave us the wonderful talk on the topic of the racial virus, COVID-19 and racism in the morning in the section. Let's welcome Professor Goldberg to join us. Also, we invite Professor Ann Warner, who gave us the thought-provoking talks on the topic of race, higher education, and COVID-19. The view from the department chair as well. Let's welcome Professor Warner to join us. The third expert is Professor Martha Hansen. She's the professor in the Institute of the History of Medicine at the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Her research fields are in the history of Chinese science and medicine, history of epidemics, disease, and the public health in China. Let's welcome Professor Hansen. The next expert is Professor Harold Schulzen. He's the professor of Beihang University in China and Philosophy of Technology and Global Ethics at Polytechnic Institute of New York University in the United States. His research fields are the philosophy of technology, global ethics, comparative philosophy, and engineering and humanities. Let's welcome Professor Schulzen. The fifth expert is Professor Philip Buckley. He is the professor of Department of Philosophy at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. His research fields are phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy. Let's welcome Professor Buckley. The next expert is Professor Chu-Kin Lee. He is the professor of the Department of Chinese Studies at National University of Singapore. His research field including Chinese culture and Chinese moral values, Taoism and East Asian Confucianism, Chinese beliefs and customs. Let's welcome Professor Lee. The next expert is Professor Bing-Zhen Xiong. She's the president of Asian New Humanities Network and the chair of the International Council of Philosophy and Human Science on New Humanities at University of California at Everett. Her research fields are in the empirical and modern China, comparative cultural and social history, history of children and pediatric medicine, public health, society, technology and medicine, and Russian culture and intellectual history. Let's welcome Professor Xiong. The next expert is Professor Xiu Chen. He is the Associate Dean of College of Public Health and the Director of MPH program at National Taiwan University. His research fields are in biostatistics, epidemiology, disease screening, and stochastic process. Let's welcome Professor Chen. The next expert is Professor Changquan Zhan. He's the Dean of College of Public Health at National Taiwan University. His research fields are in global health, air pollution, environmental epidemiology, and risk analysis. Let's welcome Professor Zhan. And now we will invite Professor Xiu Chen and Ann Warner to chair this roundtable discussion together.
Yeah, I think I pass the law of chairman to Ann and also David, please. And I think because this is a free, discussion, so we can just have interactions, no problem. So, but I trust Ann to chair this. Yeah, Ann, please.
All right. Thank you very much. Do we have about an hour?
Problem. You can because we don't need to 20 minutes about summary, so we can proceed until 11:20. Yeah.
Okay, we can proceed until 11:20. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think the way that I'd like to proceed is maybe begin by asking if people have very specific questions for either David or me, and we can talk then briefly about the talks, but then I would like to call on each of you to contribute from your own perspectives to the larger questions that are on the table. So are there any specific questions you have for either me or David?
I think first of all, I just chat with Bin Zhen and our team. Maybe we can have something in common. You know, for example, today you talking about slow violence. Yesterday we talking about slow ethics. I mean, coincidentally, you know, we don't know, you know, how is a coincident, but this is so good, you know, slogan, you know, and also keyword to think about, you know, how are two keywords related to racism, you know, something like that, you know. That's why I enjoy your speech. So I almost forget, you know, to end up your, you know, the comment. I mean, also David, you know, your two speech are so inspiring, you know, particular for marginalized population. So for me, I just start, you know, not only for racism, you know, for marginal population in the world after COVID-19 is extremely needed to be concerned, you know. So this is not only including we are talking about the population right now, we're talking about immigrant, you know, we're talking about refugee, we are talking about other marginalized population. So this is my, I just want to have some, you know, thought to share with these expert about roundtable discussion, something like that. Then we can proceed. Okay, Ann?
I'm actually not familiar with the concept of slow ethics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Bin Zhen, you want to talk about that?
So yesterday, Professor Ann Gallagher gave a talk, and the talk from her field and training on nursing ethics. It's titled "A Slow Approach to the Pandemic: A View from Care Ethics." In that, she gave a speech about the overall slow movement, and you know, which was complemented quickly from Tony's input cross-culturally from the cultural linguistic background of Chinese, but of course other native people also have that. That is to go slow, you know. And of course, you know, is a Ming historian, so she knows the daily greetings in Chinese. When you send people off, you said, 请慢走, please go slow, right? That's a well-wishing, you know. And then when you are in a meal, you ask people to enjoy the food, and you said, 请慢用, right? And so, which means that, not to say the martial art of Tai Chi, a lot of, you know, cautious, careful graciousness is built into the experience. And now, you know, very ironically, people are all being rushed to the emergency room and in an urgent situation. They can't breathe, you know. So those were one kind of viral, and then you just showed that other viral that David talked about, which also choke people and make people, you know, have problem breathing, literally. So things are returning to the basics. One, if we want to go slow, when we've received a global stop sign, and you talked about the moment of silence, then what to do next? Obviously, people know that things are going to change, whether people like it or not, because life is not going to go on as usual. You made that comment. But you know, yesterday, some other colleagues from Europe, you know, Laurent Tisson and others, also historian, he said that just as we need border crossing and international collaboration more so than before, people are locked down, and all kinds of animosity and hostilities not only were developing, but sometimes sanctioned and even supported by state governments. And so we want to have a deeper conversation about if we were to go slow, if we're going to stop, what would we like what would like this change to lead to? Also, how could we enhance collaboration, academically, professionally, so that we could benefit from working together, not just in bringing the new vaccine, which is also important, but Dean Zhan here are saying, the minute we hear you, the students and faculties here, we want to have a new course designed. So yeah, that's a start. Perhaps you should tell people about what you thought of the reaction. No. Well, Anne, it's back to you. That's just to explain to you what had happened yesterday in connection with today.
Okay, but before we start running through the list of roundtable participants, does anyone have any other kind of general comments or questions? Well, Marta, why don't I start with you? You had some thoughts. I think you're muted.
Yeah, so both of your talks were very stimulating, of course. I think with David's talk, I think that, well, let me go to the question that I posed, and then how I came to that question. So the questions that I posed to the panel before hearing both of your talks was, that COVID-19 has revealed or has brought racism even more to the surface, as we see in the anti-Asian sentiment. I mean, the way that Trump deploys it or weaponizes it, and all of that, that he's, Wuhan virus, all of that, and China's killing us, according to the Fox News. And then he uses it, mobilizes it to double down on the whole anti-immigrant policy and blocking now foreign workers, et cetera. So it's all, and of course, violence as well. And at the same time, it's revealed systemic, structural racism that both of you talked about that has resulted, that is obviously the groundwork behind the terrible healthcare disparities of the African-American population, the Native American, Hispanic, et cetera. So what I find interesting here, and I want to bring up the word apocalypse. Mm-hmm. I was listening, and the reason why I bring up apocalypse is because I was listening to Crystal Lippett's show on Being, which those of us who are in the United States, that's one of the Sunday National Public Radio shows. It's like a spiritual show for the secular. And on Sunday, April 14th, I was listening to her on a section about living the questions. So this was just a month after my undergraduate course stopped, and just a few weeks into teaching completely online because of the pandemic. And the topic was, how can I find my footing in a shifting world? And what she was talking about is that this is a moment of collective as well as individual transition. So I'm really picking up how you ended your talk, Anne, and it's a moment for reflection about who we will be as people and as institutions, as we get to become what will that be on the other side of this? Because it is a transformative moment. And so that it's individual, it's collective, it's societal, and it can be taken in very dark ways. Different people will take advantage of it, like in disaster capitalism, for example, and it can be taken in very good ways, which is what you were highlighting with specific things that have happened in Minneapolis. And what I want to say is that apocalypse, what she said was apocalypse, the original meaning contrary to what we might think of in terms of the cultural tropes like Apocalypse Now, you think of as a harrowing voyage into the dark humanity's heart of darkness. You think of a catastrophe, of calamity, of disaster, these words that have come up. But actually it means uncovering.
Oh, huh.
It means to reveal. And so by extension, it means revelation.
Like revelation, yeah, yeah.
Revelation. So that's where the apocalypse, that's why people have portrayed apocalypse as in religious ways, as the Armageddon before the divine judgment. Right. That these are revelatory moments, and there's a couple thousand years of dealing with these from biblical, from the Passover is about this.
Right.
And so what struck home to me is that this is a revelatory moment, and there are possibilities of individual and societal transformation, which David very much gestured to in very specific ways. And people I'm in Minneapolis as well too. George Floyd was murdered a few blocks from where I went to the public high school that used to be there in that neighborhood in Central High. So I think that's why I connected I think it's very closely connected. Other people have brought this up too, that the police brutality is a public health issue. It is related to structural racism. And so we have a moment with this new kind of revelations for many people who never saw things as clearly as they see it now, to do transformative work by continuing to have things, using the moment as a way of taking steps into a future that we and like-minded people can believe in. And that's how I ended my, the talk for the course that you thought of.
Right.
What I wanted to put out there is a question for our East Asian colleagues is, David brought up how Britain is not that much, it's not much different, or Europe, from what we are experiencing in the US in terms of the racism and the structural racism that's being revealed. And I wanted to, and I'm sure, and it's happening as well in East Asia, but in very different ways. And also the way that I think our East Asian colleagues are filtering the experience is not through visions of an apocalypse or the divine judgment or the four horsemen, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Those are our cultural metaphor, or the Black Death, for the matter. I think they have a very different relationship in terms of experience with the coronavirus, before that, but also how integral the nation states have been built in response to Western imperialism and war and the diseases brought upon them in the past century. So I think the main point I wanted to see was how are those two things coming up in the East Asian context in a different way than we're seeing in the Euro-American context.
Would somebody like to take a stab at beginning to answer that question?
And I thought maybe we could invite Sok-in from Singapore, who's with us too, right? Sok-in, are you still there? Is he still there?
Yep.
Okay.
Professor Lee, yeah.
Yeah, I think your expertise, your positioning, Chinese studies, Confucianism, religious studies, will be a perfect stance from where to speak. Can we all hear from you, Sok-in?
Yeah, sure, of course. Okay, yes. I think, well, the two parts of the world is facing crisis, of course, but I think for Western countries, they are facing two crises at the same time. Of course, the COVID-19 and also racism. In East Asian countries, of course, in fact, we know that COVID-19 is basically under control. So the situation is very different. Just now, Anne mentioned about the enrollment crisis in states. In fact, the same problem appears. I understand that they freeze many of the positions because of they couldn't get the foreign students. So some of the courses have to be probably closed down. But Asia, for example, in Singapore, we are facing another situation. In fact, the crisis bring a new kind of opportunity. For example, we have a self-financed master program. In the past 5 years, every year we receive about 100 to 200 applications, and then we take in 30 students. But last year, we received 500 applications. I think also because of the situation in Hong Kong. So many students, especially from China, they want to come to Singapore. So this year, we increased the enrollment double to 60 students out of almost 500 applicants. So I think the situation is very different. I think if we put it back to the COVID-19, we know that as a historian, we all know that this kind of bias, the idea that the Asians, immigrants, they are dirty, is roots in history. I think from history, we can tell that it's not a new thing. But for the COVID-19, this kind of a racist and xenophobic incidents appear all over the world. I think despite the fact that Europe and North America have more COVID-19 cases than China and Asia. So I think this epidemic is not solely to blame for the recent wave of racism. I think it's something, the prejudice that we have to get rid of from the bottom of our mind. So it's deep-rooted in the mind of some of the people. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin. It has nothing to do with educational background. It's nothing to do with social status. Even political leaders, our political interests, they try to label COVID-19 as Chinese virus. So that is prejudice. So I think, so that's why I think, well, racism and hatred will not stop the spread of the coronavirus, but create phobia and anxiety among us, and also create difficulties in bringing people together, especially across border, across country, across region cooperations. So I think in this difficult time, probably we have to be more open and more tolerant. Only then we can work together to tide over the difficulties. Thank you.
Yeah, I know of at least 2 research projects at the University of Minnesota that are designed to measure anti-Asian racism in the face of COVID-19. One of them is Richard Lee, who's a psychologist, is doing a massive study, and then a woman named Rhonda Farah, who in the medical school, she's a dermatologist. I got one of these strange emails from her saying, I'm putting together a grant proposal to do a survey instrument, and I need to have somebody look at my survey instrument and see if I've done a good job. And I wrote back and said, you know, not only have I never written the survey instrument, I've never used a survey instrument, but I put her in touch with Rich Lee and then with somebody else in sociology who does survey instruments. And 2 of her students are going to do a year-long study of anti-Asian racism, particularly in Minnesota. And they are both Asian American Minnesota women who are medical students. And so I think that, you know, those kinds of studies don't solve the problem, but I think that if we get a more nuanced sense of what the problem is, we may be in a better position to solve it. And you know, there've been for a long time now, there've been press reports that say, well, you know, genetic modeling of the virus that devastated New York clearly shows it came from Italy. It didn't come directly from China. And I mean, in a sense, that's irrelevant to the racism, but it's still, yeah, people stopped eating at Chinese restaurants. They didn't stop eating at Italian restaurants.
Yes, in fact, many of my friends in Italy, they told me, well, this kind of virus started in Italy in November last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's much earlier than it appeared in Asia. So, but of course, people try to ignore it.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very difficult to identify the origin of the virus, and there are so many different theories. But I think, the important thing is this virus affects all Asian group, so not only one. Even political leadership already been, infected. So I don't think, from the genetical viewpoint, I mean, we can have a very good research to support, but I think this is a time to solve the problem of these social issues, which is more important than the biological, the possibility. Yeah.
One of the things that I sort of mentioned in passing in my talk is of the 3 officers who observed George Floyd being murdered, one was African American and one was Asian American. And it seems to me that, that what that shows is that the structures of police brutality, which are, I think, built upon notions of white supremacy, are so pervasive that not belonging to the group of white doesn't make you immune from participating in that kind of violence. And the man who murdered George Floyd had an Asian American wife. I mean, so there's a way in which white supremacy, and I think that white supremacy is an issue here, that white supremacy isn't something that's just limited to white people. I mean, which I think makes it all the more pervasive and complicated. I mean, that African, he's mixed race, but he identifies as African American, that there was no way those officers felt like it was their job to intervene in the 8 minutes that it took, just really suggests to me, obviously it suggests that there are problems with the Minneapolis Police Department, but it also suggests to me just how deeply pervasive and pernicious these structures are. Would anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Marta.
Yeah.
Just to back up, there was a report in NPR as well from, I can't remember which African country, but saying that the legacies of the colonial period are carried through, even though it's black on black violence, black on black police brutality. It's not strictly, we have to look at the powers, associated.
Right. I mean, there's, right. Yeah.
I was going to ask Phil or Harold.
The long time.
To say something, because both of them operated in both the Asian context, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai for Harold, and then Phil in Indonesia, and they in China. So they must have a lot to say. They're both philosophers.
I have a couple of thoughts. First, I just want to say thank you to both of the keynote presenters for really excellent and thought-provoking presentations to get us started on this, vital and just really huge topic. I was thinking about picking up first on a point that Marta made, and then relating a little bit specifically to the things that David brought up. you mentioned apocalypse and the possibility of this being a sort of a turning point one way or the other. So this morning in the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg wrote an op-ed with the headline, "America's Too Broke to Fix."
Yeah.
And later today, Dr. Robert Redfield, the head of the CDC, said coronavirus has brought this nation to its knees. So it's a pretty pessimistic moment, I think. But when you mentioned apocalypse, it reminded me that this is part and parcel of something that is central to Western civilization. St. Paul, I think it was in his epistle to the Ephesians, is talking about how we need to arm ourselves against an invisible enemy, and uses sort of proto-warlike metaphors for how to fight the good fight and how to be pure and how to sustain yourself and how to advance strength and this kind of thing. And it seems to me that the war metaphor, which is being used to describe the virus, which I have many problems with, and which I think is causing more harm, even if its purpose is to try to unite us to fight the good fight or something like that. It's doing more harm. But there's a level of it in which it makes sense, because there are two levels perhaps. One, we feel like we're fighting an invisible enemy. And the second is we're very damn confused about what's going on. So it's sort of the fog of war that we don't know how to make decisions or the right decision. But I think in the midst of this kind of warlike postulation, that we have so many correlations and associations between racism and aspects of the spread of the virus. And the enemy seems to be unclear to us that what this is going to do is promote sort of almost inevitably a kind of scapegoating. We're going to look for an enemy. We want to define an enemy. And so I think it was very easy for the American administration to just look upon the sort of fortuitous fact that the virus, as we understood it at the time, had its beginnings in China, in Wuhan, and scapegoat the Chinese as the cost of it, and this correlated very nicely with his failing trade, war kind of thing, and so on and so forth. I mean, how much of fighting the coronavirus is really fighting Huawei is a question I might ask. The other thing that occurred to me when I thought about scapegoating as compared to racism was, how do we look at these groups, and particularly how do we look at Chinese? And the things that are being said, the pernicious things that are being said, are like, well, you know what they eat, and you know that they have all this kind of secret money and power, and they're manipulative, and you don't know what they're doing. Or in other words, evoke many of the tropes that you also saw or see in anti-Semitism. So it seems to me that there's an interesting parallel there, and it may suggest that it's slightly different from the kind of racist devastation that we're seeing in the United States and so on and so forth. The structural failings in the United States are, of course, structural racism, but also structural failure in how we deliver the healthcare, structural failure in how we are underfunding education, how we're not providing, proper remediation for poverty and all of this. That are some thoughts. And I just wanted to say, what sorts of, since I do work in ethics, what are some of the ethical issues specifically that emerge from this? And one is, following up on the point that you, Anne, made very clearly about, how do we make decisions when we don't even know what the relative factors are? We don't know how to use data and so on and so forth. But it seems that, the best defense against the virus is going to include all sorts of, collecting of information, and it's going to be contact tracing, and it's going to be also inoculations and following up, and many, many things, so that one of the strong ethical issues is going to have to be with issues of privacy, issues of individual freedom, individual choice, those kinds of things. But those questions are being radically reframed, it seems to me, in the face of these multiple crises that are upon us right now. So those are my thoughts. I just I really appreciate the two very interesting perspectives that this problem was presented from in the two talks, and it's really opened my mind to think really much more than I have been. So thank you again.
I think the privacy issue may doom us. I mean, I think that when I was talking to people in classroom management about the possibility of taking people's temperatures, that we can't do that. I think tracing that the American desire for privacy is so strong that I think people will act in ways that are not in their own self-interest and are certainly not in collective self-interest, and that worries me a lot. And people say, "Oh, I'm young and healthy. It's none of your business what I do. If I expose myself, I'm just exposing myself," and it's sort of without having any sort of idea about the responsibility that we all bear for networks, and the refusal to wear masks. I mean, you don't have a right to tell me to wear a mask, and all of that. I mean, I think all of that. I find all of that. I mean, I gave an optimistic talk, but I actually find all of that really, really quite terrifying. That I'm an American. You can't boss me around because we have our rights and we have our freedoms, and I don't. I mean, it may be that when everyone knows 2 or 3 people who died of the disease, then it will become real. But I think that the ethical issues, like being able to think of the collective in ways that might override your right to decide not to wear a mask, is something that we're still, for a lot of people, a long ways away from.
Yeah, and of course, the attitude for these things, testing, masks, social tracking, all of these things in China and in East Asia are extraordinarily different and benefit them greatly. I think we have a terrible time understanding what we might mean by the common good. And so if we were going to address these kinds of ethical issues, I think rather than framing them in terms of arguments about, autonomous rights, we have to think more in terms of a concept of the common good, and that's a project for philosophers.
Yeah, I think we have a steep learning curve in the United States and Europe on both on collective, responsibility, and also what I would call collective consciousness and contagion consciousness. And the final point I want to make on this is that what we are seeing is a reversal of the sick man of Asia. Now we are the Euro-American, we are the sick men of the world, and it's complete reversal of what the situation was in the end of the 19th century. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it in the past 200-year frame. A major transformation is just, I think that the quote of the head of the CDC, that coronavirus has, Robert Redfield, has brought the nation to its knees. It may need to take each family and individual to its knees to have them realize that they need to have a contagion consciousness, and they need to think collectively, as the East Asian nation states and people have had to do because of the military foreign invasion and having to develop with, an infrastructure to deal with the epidemics they've had to deal with in the past century and not just the past 20 years. That's my main point.
Yeah.
Still there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the project of conceptualizing the common good in a way that makes good sense to ordinary citizens is I mean, that's a really important project.
It's Professor Buckley still there? Phil?
Sure.
Yeah, you're a philosopher.
Can we hear from you, please? You look like a
Sure.
philosopher now.
Yeah.
Very, very philosophical, huh?
Very, very happy to join you, and really thanks to David and to Anne for the talks. Enjoyed them very much and learned a lot. Let me just say that my own presentation, which I sent as an abstract, was an attempt to maybe think something that is at work in both David's talk, definitely, and also Anne's, which is that the way this, say, pandemic overlaps with other crises plays out in different ways in different locales. And so I referred to the specific situation in Montreal, in Quebec. And I think what I was trying to do is to suggest that marginalized or racialized communities which suffer disproportionately in a pandemic like this do so under different sets of circumstances. So in a way, maybe it's a little bit of a challenging comment to David and to Marta, I think, and to Anne, that I do sense a little tone that the American experience is sort of normative for racism. And I think one of the things I'd like to say is that racism may be universal, but the way it actually plays itself out is different in different locations. So in the situation I was referring to in long-term healthcare corresponds with David's thesis about healthcare workers, often at the lower ends of the healthcare spectrum. So orderlies, people who do the laundry, change bedpans, and so on. Often these people are immigrants because the local community won't do it. And in Montreal, that takes a very particular shape because we're a French-speaking society. So this is really largely the Haitian community that's been impacted. And so in a way, the general thesis about the virus showing some forms of structural racism stands true, but the way it comes out is quite different.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually important to stress. Again, people have spoken almost as though there's a perfect symmetry between indigenous communities and Black communities. That's not the case in Canada. In Canada, the indigenous communities have hardly been touched by this. People are still trying to figure out why. So, but I think the emphasis that I'm trying to make is you have to, it's very important that we make sort of refined local observations rather than too general, the US and the UK are the same. No one mentioned Canada, but we're kind of the same, but in between those two big places. But we also have some differences, which may be better or worse in any given condition.
Yeah. No, I think that those are great points. I mean, I think that that American race relations, at least as they pertain to Black people, but probably it carries over, have been conditioned by slavery. I mean, and that one can say, well, the problem with European race relations isn't conditioned by slavery, but it's conditioned by colonialism and the problems in Canada are conditioned by settler colonialism and by immigration. And so, I mean, that one could sort of define overarching structures, but North American slavery makes things fundamentally different, and I think fundamentally harder. And you know that the recent scholarship on slavery, and by recent I guess I mean in the last 20 or 30 years, have made it very clear that the wealth of the nation was built to a large degree by slave labor. I mean, it wasn't simply the cotton plantations in the South. So I mean, there is a way in which what the United States became was on the backs of unacknowledged and unpaid labor, and you know that there's a lot of very deep anger about that. And so I know I take your point. I take your point really well. And I mean I think the United States failure in dealing with COVID-19. I mean there are European failures as well, but I mean the Canadian border has been closed for a long time, right? I mean
yes, and this is quite funny, Anne, because there's talk about how can we open up other borders without opening up the American border.
I mean, you know, clearly, and the EU was talking about banning Americans. You know, I mean, I think, you know, I have not, I mean, I go for walks and I live in a house with a yard, so I garden, but my husband and I went to a fairly isolated park about an hour away, and it was the first time I'd been in a car since March. And kind of jokingly, I said to him, "Oh, the snow is all gone." I mean, it's sort of, you know, this sort of weird. I mean, we're just completely hunkering down. I mean, he goes to the grocery store. I don't even go to the grocery store. But you know, I think that. I mean, I think American failures at dealing with this are structural and systemic, but they're also made much worse by completely terrible political leadership. And, you know, that I think, you know, it would have been a very, very hard thing for anyone to deal with. And, you know, we're worse than leaderless, I think. I mean, you know, we've got somebody who's saying, oh, masks are something that people wear to show political opposition. And, you know, it's very depressing.
I think one of the things that's interesting, and really this maybe back to what Harold was saying, and something that David said, is one of the things I'm concerned about really is
Phil, we cannot hear you very clearly. Yeah, Phil. Yeah. You get close to your micro. Yeah, close to your microphone. Yeah.
Well, I'm on my phone, so I don't know. How is that?
Yes, okay.
Is that a bit better?
You're clear, yeah.
Okay. So I'm very interested in the vocabulary of these discussions. And I agree with Harold. I'm somehow deeply disturbed by the war vocabulary from the beginning. And it's not as though we became carriers of viruses in January or November, as David said, 2019. I mean, we've always been carriers of viruses. And so you wonder, and I don't think this language of war is just instrumentally manipulated by it is being, but I wonder really where its origin comes from.
Yeah.
It seems pretty present across the political spectrum. everyone says it's a war on the virus. And I don't know what the poor virus did. For us, I mean, it's just doing what viruses do. Maybe I'd like to defend the virus standpoint. There's something deeply disturbing about the conceptions of self and collectivity and the war language that are being unconcealed, I think.
Yeah, when I used to direct an interdisciplinary research institute, and I invited Michael Osterholm to give a talk during either H1N1 or SARS, and he was giving a very detailed, I mean, he was really talking about the virus and what the virus could do and how the virus replicated. And at the end of the Q&A, one of the people said to him, "It sounds to me like you admire that virus." And he said, "Yeah, I kind of do." You know, I hope I don't get it, but I kind of admire it. Well, I mean, Marta, in your study of Chinese epidemics, do you find the language of war? Marta has written a book on epidemics in China.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's prevalent there too. It's a general that needs to take down, you know.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm. They use the general, and actually, yes, I would say that it's there as well. And certainly you want to, the earliest metaphors are of protecting a body are of creating a fortress around yourself, for example. Yeah.
That's a very particular view of the self. It may be quite ancient, but it's this kind. It certainly has picked up strength in modernity, say in the West. It's this kind of isolated, immunologized self, and I don't even think it's very descriptive of the way we are, shot through with permeable borders, and as I think both Anne and David were suggesting. So it's very peculiar. So I guess my question is really how that language of war feeds off a particular conception of subjectivity that may itself be lurking around the origin of a lot of these issues and discussions and our vocabulary.
I don't actually, I was going to say, I was trying to think about back to the 1918 influenza epidemic, and then I remembered I actually don't have enough information in my head to actually think about the 1918 influenza epidemic, but to think about whether war metaphors might have been used then. I mean, and that's more complicated because it actually, I mean, it is deeply implicated with a real war.
You know, the plague in China from the end of the Qing dynasty up until the 18th century, they used lots of war metaphors and martial defenses. So I looked that up recently. It's not something I would know, but
we're all on our computer. Yeah. But it is, I mean, well, so Philip, can you think of other kind of language to talk about?
As I've been posing this question to you, I've been thinking myself, and I must say it's very hard to come up with one. And that's why I'm very interested in the way language might be, you know, I mean, I'm a Heideggerian, so language already worlds us. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though we just pick up language as an instrument and use it. We already are embedded in a world in which this language of war has some sort of pre-given meaning. And so we express all of our relationships in terms of it one way or another. And so I think one of the things that might be lurking at the end of David's talk there was very much a kind of call for a transformation in language.
Yeah.
But I don't have that myself. I can't.
Well, you know, something that might be interesting to look at. Marta, is Gianna Pomada now at Johns Hopkins? Marta?
No. I've just been told that Anyway, my microphone causes beeping, so I'm trying to limit my talking. No, she's retired as of last year and she's moved to Bologna. But what I wanted to say about language, just quickly, is that many traditional Chinese medicine treatments of COVID are not about attacking and expelling the virus. It's about accommodating the body to be able to live with it. It's a very different metaphor of how to understand the body. And when I say that the fortress of the body, the idea is if you have your own strength within, you won't be susceptible to invasion from without. But the way that the therapeutics are structured, and I've talked with clinicians today, it's not about eradications, it's not about elimination. It's about how do you accommodate, how do you live with, how do you, it's a very different kind of metaphor.
So I have two things to say. One is a colleague who was a colleague of mine and then became a colleague of Marta's, a wonderful medical historian named Gianna Pomata, wrote a book some time ago. I think it was called The Promise to Heal. And it was about probably about 18th century Bologna, where sick people and doctors would make contracts that I've come to you to heal me, and when I reach this state, this is how we will know that I have been healed. And it seems to me that might be a really interesting place to look and think about language. The other thing is, AIDS drugs and the way AIDS is now talked about. I mean, one doesn't talk about conquering AIDS. One talks about drugs that enable the body to accommodate. And so, I mean, I think that is a that is a way to thinking about disease, because it does strike me that's fundamentally different.
Right, and I just want to add that I think that as a society we have to think that way too, because this won't be the first coronavirus or influenza that we're going to be dealing with in the next decades to come. So I do think that we need to model ourselves on our East Asian nation-state colleagues going forward, because this is just the beginning in my mind. And I hope that the reins are shifted to positive ways, but I'm afraid that the negative forces are going to be taking advantage of the situation too.
Two sources that might contribute to this are reflections on language and different ways of thinking about the disease. I recently was rereading Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, which I think frames the issue of disease and so on a very interesting way. There's a newer book by a scholar named Judith Farquhar on Chinese medicine in comparison to Western medicine, which I'm just starting to read, and it strikes me it offers a perspective that might be useful in this discussion as well. You've read the book, Marta? Yeah.
It's interesting to think about illness as a metaphor for things other than illness. I mean, like, the sick man of Europe, the sick man of Asia, talk about, a disease in society that needs to be struck out. So, I mean, illness is used as a metaphor for other things. And then war is a metaphor that is used for illness and combating. I just did it. Combating illness. So that's all pretty interesting. Yeah, thinking about the language that we use.
If you read obituaries, you notice that nobody who dies of cancer dies without a fight. I mean, people always fight cancer, and that's so this notion that disease is something that a warlike response to is very deep.
David, do you have anything at this point to add to the conversation?
To get in the conversation for the last 15 minutes. I have lots to say. I mean, the first thing to say is that I feel a bit out of sorts that, you know, a bunch of white people from America are talking about racism solely in America, even though it is, of course, a white problem, but be that as it may. I'll address a number of points over here. You know, to declare a war against a virus, I think, is to declare a war against ourselves, both in the singular. There's a sense in which the virus is of us and in us. So it's fighting oneself, effectively, as deep as Harold has pointed to, that it runs in our constitutive being, perhaps. And it's to declare war against ourselves collectively, as I was trying to point out in my talk, right? That as soon as one declares a war against a virus, one is declaring a war against the people who have the virus or bear the virus. And there's a kind of ambiguity in that declaration at work, right? So I think there are lots of ways, and you know, the way Marshall was pointing to a different modality, I think in a Western genre would be about managing the illness rather than, and managing the conditions that produce or serve to produce the illness. And what we're facing in the United States, and perhaps in some other societies, like Brazil, for example, or Britain, perhaps, and differentially in different states in the US, are different ways of managing and not managing or mismanaging the virus. It turns out that the increase in the past week across states in America, 18 of the top 20 increases in the virus are in states that have Republican governors, and 17 of the 24 states that have seen reductions over the past week are in states that have Democratic governors. And there's something, I mean, you know, not to privilege Democrats over Republicans. I mean, you know, all politicians have faults in this. But there's a kind of disposition to how one manages in times of you know, contestation of this kind. I think is you know, is something to take account of. And what I was trying to point to about a culture of caring and an infrastructure of caring, in contrast to a culture that doesn't, I think, sort of plays into this. There's effectively not just 3 crises, but 4. There's or not 2, but 4 even. I mean, there's a pandemic, there's racism, there's the climate or the environmental, and there's the economic, and all 4 are interactive with each other. And in a culture in which the infrastructure of caring has been stripped apart, you know, the challenges that are posed by those forms of interaction, I think, magnify sort of over time. To Philip's point, all my work has been exactly about that. I mean, in a half-hour talk, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make it more nuanced, but there is not a single racism. There are racisms. I mean, Stuart Hall's work has spoken to this extensively over time, the late, great Stuart Hall. Racism is not a single problem. It's a whole configuration of problems interactive with each other. Racism in one place is borne out only by racism in other places. And by you know, the contestation against racism requires coalitions across societies, countries, spaces, interactive engagements of various kinds, even taking into account and consideration the way in which it plays out differently in the different places. I totally agree with you, right? I mean, the very pluralizing of the condition, I think, sort of bears that out. And then just about the issues of ethics, questions of ethics. You know, I mean, as important as slow ethics may be, I think I think what's happening in the United States at the moment, and that's spilled over into European societies, South Africa, Brazil in a certain sort of way, pushing back now, and so on, is that we're way beyond slow ethics. As important as it is to think in a sustained way about, addressing the structural problems facing us, if we don't begin very quickly to face up to what's facing us now, the place is going to be torn down. I mean, there's no waiting on this. That's what revolutions are about, right? I mean, we're seeing revolutions happen both in quote unquote nature and socially. Revolutions by their very conception are quick. They happen, you don't see them coming, and then there's a long sort of duration afterwards in which the details get worked out and goes one way rather than another. That's not to praise revolutions, just an observation about how revolutions happen. And so I think, we're in a very unsettled moment, not least in the United States. And slowness is, even while it's important to think in a slow, sustained way, addressing these problems are going to require some, the fact that the Minneapolis City Council said we're going to dismantle the police department, I think is an observation about the seriousness of the problem facing them and facing us collectively. The police can't be the same as the police have been, no matter what some politicians are saying. Defund the police might not be getting rid of the police completely, but it's got to be thought of, as people are now thinking about it, in dramatically different ways. Right.
Right.
Yeah. The difference between safety and security, I think, runs quite deep over here. This is not about a technology of securitization anymore. It's about making people safe.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with David's, the point, particular for he mentioned about the systematical configuration of the resident, the issue. I want to share with my idea of when I saw the David proposed the racial virus, and I can also, share with something about this is not only virus, because if you study cervical cancer, if you study which is related to, virus as well as a human papilloma virus, but it's become a chronic disease, and this also attack, differentially between the different racial group. I mean, the same thing happened to all the racial group. David just mentioned today even for the COVID-19. So I would rather say, this is a racial, you can say racial cancer, racial disease. So, this is a long problem in terms of the structural process outcome. In epidemiology, we used to use outcome to argue with how it is inequitable for assessing health care for different racial group and in terms of the marginalized population. So I think this is so important. It's not only when I saw the George days, I think this is only the branch of the tree. The main problem is not police. The main problem is the long-term systemical infrastructures behind the scenes to have some inequality between the racial group. That's why WHO proposed, the SDG, and one of the goals we want to achieve. So, unfortunately, this virus, I think, we also argue with the name about this so many times in our Asian Chinese peoples as well. And I can share you one experience. One of the taxi driver asked me, why is it called the coronavirus? they don't understand coronavirus. So then I immediately tell him, and he laughed at me, I mean, I think this is crown virus because the shape is like crown. So, so the taxi driver immediately understand, crown, crown. So so he immediately give me a answer is, so crown means, king. So king and queen cannot be defeated. So are we facing with a big issue, in the world? Then I just shock, this is a response from taxi driver in Taiwan, That's why Taiwan, I mean, Martha, you asked me about Asian colleague, Taiwan is quite different from other countries. Our government, our peoples are very, very keen to taking a collective approach rather than the individual approach. So they have very good compliance with the wearing mask, and following the social distance strategy, and also even digital contact tracing. They know they have a privacy, equity, fairness problem, but they agree with the government to use this regulation. But I cannot say this can be applied to to other regions. But in some Asian countries, they really take very, very collective approach rather than the individual approach. So for me, I think David just proposed very important title, racial violence. I think this is so important, so important titles, and also I think this brought up so many new thought, to think over rather than the COVID-19, but for other disease, which we always not fail, not do justice to the facial group we are concerned with. Yeah. So I think it's just so good to talk this, and I also I want to ask our maybe our team to make a comment about. And if you do not disagree with that, I will ask our dean to make some comment about, because international borders, how we can have integration, the cooperation across borders to, to control the COVID-19. That would be very the good discussion about, in addition to the special topical we raised today, but we have to together to deal with this issue, at the national, international levels.
Yeah, I listened to a lot of discussion today, and I really enjoy all the perspective you provide. That fits in my observations of this ongoing pandemic. Virus is a bad thing. It's a kind of evil impinge on all of us. So cause us ills and death. But if we look at from another perspective, that's our Taiwanese always have kind of a positive attitude to that. It's kind of revelations. So the revelations we are discussing today is racism. And through our observation of what's happening mainly in the US, I think it's not only the black and white issues. We also see this black, yellow, brown. There's a lot of overlap, and one color has hegemony of dominance on these issues, but between them, there's still some kind of overlap. And as Asians are discriminated in the beginning, but we saw that blacks, are even discriminated by this racism in this during this pandemic in terms of infections or deaths and or other structures racism we are talking about. And one thing that people overlook if you are only look at Europe, what Europe is doing or the North America is doing, the Asians has some kind of racisms which are not so obvious. So on this part, I kind of has different explanation from our Singaporeans perspective. You know, from Taiwan, we saw that the way our Asian countries, Asian developed countries are treating our migrant workers has some kind of racism there. That's a cause of pandemic in many countries, and Taiwan is still worried about that. And the anxiety or the worries actually has some kind of racism tone there. So give you an example, my student from India, and I discussed with him about the situation in India, and it's very easy. It's after one or two sentence of discussions, and it's become Hindus and Muslims. So it's very easy for us in society unintentionally, you or unconsciously, you just blame others. So I think that's a distinction between me and others. Then you group together us and others. So from this border control is us, then others. Then if you are thinking about these quarantines, now we are relying on this PCR test, say this person is positive or potentially to be positive. Then in Taiwan, you have to separate from your family. So your family members become others, okay? Then if you are analyze all these clusters, so the clusters patients or suspected patients become them, and we become us. So we have to quarantine others. Then if you come to this atomic view, the most powerful thing is wearing mask. Okay, so we got this powerful messages, don't go to crowd. If you want to go to crowd, you must wear a mask. But in Taiwan, wearing mask is protecting others, because we really don't know whether we have the virus or not. But in Western cultures, seems to me, you know, wearing mask is because you have presumably to be sick, and you should not come to infect us. So this kind of cultural difference, and I observe, you know, back in March, I have a discussion in both America with the former director of CDC, Tom Freeman, and I told him that our Taiwanese experience wearing mask, universal wearing mask, works. But he disagreed. He said, based on science, it's not working. Until now, we entered June, and it's universal wearing mask become a guideline worldwide. However, it's appalling to see the difference in different parts of the U.S., you know, and the tone of wearing masks become a cultural war or class wars. So that's something deeper than science. That's how our humanities approach would be very important to decipher that. And I just give cultural explanations. In our literatures or cultures, our heroes are wearing masks. You know, and in Western literatures, your heroes are wearing covering the eyes, and your villains are always covering the mouth or nose. So that's some kind of things deeper in the culture before. And so we think we are wearing masks to protect us. We are heroes, you know. And if our kids, my daughter is in Germany, and she told me that wearing masks in the public 3 months ago, and people will have a different ways of looking at her, and even up to a little bit harassment. And now everybody in Germany, and if you go to the grocery store or department store, you have to wear a mask. So something actually can be educated and can be at least demystifies useful tools to protect us in this time when we don't have machines. So that's what I think that we have to do more education. That's I propose. You know, after this kind of workshop, conference, I think it's time for us to do more education, to educate both in, in East and West. And we have the power to demystify some kinds of prejudice and uncertainty and anxiety and fears through our interpretation of scientific data and also the cultural literacies. That's how I hope we can do. And our biggest challenge in the future is not just the virus, it's the origins of the diseases. It's also related to these borders. You know, we like to blame others. It's safer for us to say the problem is from China and the problem from Italy. Now the problem probably from Texas or New York. But that doesn't help a lot. And how to do that? I think our College of Public Health has done some experience to working with our social scientists and historians, anthropologists. I think we would step up with this health and humanity as our core values in the future. So we'd like to educate. So I will invite all of you to join us when we are planning courses to offer online, not just for students in Taiwan, probably students in the world. And we can take this challenge as a kind of a revelations time that for us to reveal the fundamental problems we are facing, and they are hidden for a long time, but this virus makes us to reveal that. There's ugly sides of our humanity, and probably we have to deal with that. So with this, I'm very pleased to join the whole morning in Taiwan for evening in the US. And thank you for giving us such enlightenment that I personally enjoy. And hopefully you can continue cooperate with us. And again, Tony and I has planned this meeting for a long time. I really like to bring you back to the new normal society, has some kinds of in-person conference again. And that time we can have a discussion, and hopefully we can have some kind of a social gathering with safe social distancing, to have some drink and some kind of interactions that time. So yeah, keep in touch, and if this situation improves, we'd like to have in-person conference again. So thank you for all your participation.
So before we end our online conference, may I ask all the guests to turn on your camera, and we'll have a group photo together.
You do that?
Okay. So. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, cheers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you, all of you. Yeah, I think that's the all the meeting we already touched, and I know this is a quite different meeting style, and I thank David and Anne for the two wonderful speech, and also for other experts. And because I'm the organizer of these meetings, I have to respond for everything, you know. So following our dean, we will try to arrange, you know, the formal course, you know, in the future to make this topical become very systematical and to make a contribution to the world. As I said, medical and the healthcare field cannot achieve the success without humanity experts help these peoples. Without your perspective and your viewpoint, academical in my medical field, in the healthcare field, will become slow. That's why yesterday we have some feeling about that. So we are going to close, the meeting, in order to be punctual. And I know now is the evening at the your time zone. You must be very exhausted. And thank you again for everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you from Nepal.